All right. Hi, everyone. Today we return back more explicitly to our discussion of the American Renaissance authors and introduce our first two authors, Poe and Hawthorne, who are officially deemed dark romantic writers. We'll continue to work on defining some familiar keywords then and move away from the hopefulness of the transcendentalists to the darker underbelly of early American literature. Douglas has started to get us in that direction, but we're going to end this semester with lots of darkness. It's a great way to end. So as a reminder, we get our definition of the term American Renaissance from Mathiasson, who helped define two main strains of writing from the 1820s to the 1860s. We've covered our transcendentalists and are now focused on our pessimists. As a note, Mathiasson did reject Poe for not being democratic, his language, enough in his lineage. But scholars now classify Poe's work as part of the subgenre of American Romanticism, alongside figures of Hawthorne and Melville, among others. So a bit on our two main authors for this week. Like Thoreau and Whitman, Hawthorne was influenced by transcendental thought. He briefly participated in a utopian society called Brook Farm, founded by prominent transcendentalists. He eventually broke from the project and later wrote not kindly about Brook Farm in The Blithedale Romance, a novel from 1852. Hawthorne's literary success largely came through the writings of his best-selling novels in the 1850s, like The Scarlet Letter. He had published shorter fiction prior to that, but the American reading community wasn't robust enough to really support his work. Early scholars often considered his work highbrow, work that doesn't necessarily appeal to the masses. Poe, on the other hand, was a very popular writer both at the time he was writing and today. And despite his immense popularity, Poe was more interested in becoming an author associated with more elite literary publications. This desire was reflected in his career's transformation over time, where he begins with popular poems like The Raven and Annabel Lee, gains fame with his short stories, both Gothic and detective fiction, before migrating then to literary criticism, where he earns the nickname of the Tomahawk Critic for his scathing critiques. He eventually does seek to found his own magazine that's marketed to an elite audience. Now, one of Poe's central contributions to American literature is through the Gothic genre. Gothic literature tends to be associated with British writing. It peaks in the 1830s and often features settings and events established before the Enlightenment. Such literature explored irrationality and superstition during the Age of Reason. In America, we associate the first Gothic writings with a man named Charles Brockden Brown, who was writing in the late 18th century. And Poe was familiar with Brown's work and would later come to influence later Gothic writers like Faulkner and Flannery O'Connor. And specifically, we consider those authors Southern Gothic writers. Poe has a kind of troubling relationship to Southern literature. So he's kind of Southern, but he's also kind of not. If you're reading a Gothic text now, you might expect to find some of these key traits that's pointed out on your slide. In Poe's work for today, we'll definitely see number 6, the idea of the double or the doppelganger, which is the fancier terms in the twins that are featured in his story. Now, the presence of the doppelganger is an example of what we call the uncanny, a central feature of the Gothic. As the slide says, the uncanny has to do with the troubling of definitions, with a fundamental disturbance of what we think and feel, and often includes strange kinds of repetition. Now, Poe, to a certain extent, was a master of the uncanny. But arguably all dark romantic writers were, because one of the key traits of dark romantic writings was an embrace of ambiguity, a troubling, if you will, of our interpretive ability. There's a lot more play in the literature of the 19th century than what we see in the 18th century, a little bit less straightforward or didactic meanings in the text. You have to dig more, unearth things more a little. Indeed, most scholars now argue that the American Gothic and dark romantic writing should really be grouped together. The division that Mathiasson placed between Poe and dark romantic writers like Melville and Hawthorne was based in part on a subjective definition of what qualified as high art, one that we've rejected as we broaden our understanding of what counts as literature and who counts as worthy writers. Remember that Mathiasson largely privileged only white male authors, which was a problematic selection that we've been working to kind of revise. So broadly speaking, dark romanticism is a reaction against the transcendentalism of Emerson. We tend to see a belief in the innate depravity and brutality of mankind rather than the hopefulness we associate with transcendental writing. Their writing tends to express a concern with depicting social injustice, especially in regards to representations of the poor, of women, and African Americans. Yet this critique is not quite explicit, but often presented as a repressed secret found in Gothic literature, something that you have to kind of dig to unearth. What this repressed secret is in American writings is what makes it uniquely American. So while Gothic literature was traditionally a European genre, most scholars argue that the American Gothic reveals specifically our own nation's cultural anxieties and fears. We can see threads of these anxieties and fears in a vast array of writings that we might not classify as traditionally Gothic, including genres like the captivity narrative, the slave narrative, as well as the writings of our dark romantic authors. So in fact, scholars like Teresa Godot, and as we'll see next week, Toni Morrison, have suggested that the tendency to argue that dark romantic writers weren't producing Gothic texts is a problematic attempt to ignore how such work was interested in the nation's cultural anxieties and fears. Older scholars like Mathiassen's only wanted to read them from a formalist lens, thinking about their artistic quality rather than their historical or cultural engagement, their significance. This essentially evacuates, as Godot points out, the darkness of racial meaning. Instead, we should understand that these writings are haunted by race. How can we not think that, considering how prominent slavery was and its implicit connection to notions of democracy? But also to think about how other social contexts, like the inequality of men and women, the presence of the poor, the stifling of divergent sexualities, how these social contexts emerge in these writings as kind of a repressed secret, something the dominant society doesn't want openly acknowledged, yet is there nonetheless. So as we read our stories for this week, look not only for Gothic tropes, but also for how our authors may be directly, or even better yet, ambiguously gesturing toward what might be the period's prominent anxieties. More of this in the discussion video, where I give you two interpretations that I've created for The Fall of the House of Usher and The Minister's Black Veil. But here are some questions that can perhaps guide you in these thoughts, so feel free to use them for your discussion postings if you feel inspired. Thanks for tuning in.